Welcome to Biblio Ventures, Monsters and Ghosts. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we're going on a Biblio Venture through the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and a Christmas Carol. This is episode 1 on Jekyll and Hyde, and joining me as co-host from across the pond at late at night for you in England is Paul M. Chapman. Hi, Paul.
Hello. Yes, it's a midnight broadcast over here, which is absolutely fitting for the subject of Jekyll and Hyde. That's for sure.
Very fitting. Yeah, we should do it here at midnight, but I need more people watching live. Do you like the new credit sequence? Scott Banks created our new credits.
It's wonderful. I love both the visuals and the music.
And the music. That's Pleated
perfect.
Gazelle. The musical identity of Tucker Christine, and people who have watched these shows for a long time remember Tucker was a co-host on Sundays with Dracula way back in the day. We've now gone from Dracula, Paul, then we did Frankenstein. See, you should have known. I wish I had known you back then.
Yes.
Dracula, then we did Frankenstein,
Yes.
then we did Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice. We're just finishing up the Pickwick Papers, 20-month show on the Pickwick Papers, and Sherlock Holmes, which I did 40 episodes of in a year. That was a lot of Sherlock and a lot of fun, and those will continue actually as a monthly show.
Never have too much Sherlock.
Never. Well, everyone, if you are watching live right now, and I can see you all in the live chat, please like and subscribe to this channel. Like these videos, subscribe to this channel, and have fun in the live chat. If you're new to Biblio Ventures, the live chat during the show is fun, and it's your community. Talk to each other, share with each other your reading experience. You can ask questions. Maybe they'll wind up on the show, and we can answer them while Paul and I have our conversational annotation about this book, at least about the select chapters we're covering every week. But have fun in the live chat, and it always remains there on the YouTube channel with the video. If you're watching the recording right now, hi, welcome. I also ask you to please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the show. For all you new viewers to Biblio Ventures, all the episodes again remain on YouTube. So it's easy to catch up or just watch any time. One more note of business before we begin. We bring this show to you free of charge, but if you would consider making a donation to the Rosenbach, it would be much appreciated. Thank you if you have already donated to the Rosenbach. I know many of you have, or become members of the Rosenbach. That's really how I get to do this show for free, because of your support for the Rosenbach. So if you've not already donated or become a member, I invite you to do so. And we have a special offer for new members. If you become a member the day of, as you're watching this live on this day, then you will receive an additional month added to your membership. So you get 13 months instead of 12, and that will always remain during the show. So if you don't do it on this one, do it on the next one. Well, as the day of the show is what it has to be dated. So you don't even have to watch it exactly as it's live. It just needs to be recorded on that day in our records. Paul, part of this show, since Dracula, has always been cocktails. Basically, with your able assistance, Paul, I smoke and drink and talk about books. That's what I do here.
I approve of all three things.
And we have some fabulous Jekyll and Hyde cocktails ready for everyone in each episode. Our Jobi Zink is her name, and she is our registrar and associate director of collections at the Rosenbach. She's also a talented mixologist, and she has created both cocktails and mocktails for every episode for all of you to enjoy while you watch. You can find the recipes in the description on the YouTube show in the description section, but I also send them out a week ahead of time. So if you're registered for the show a week ahead of time, I send you an email about the upcoming episode, and I also include the cocktail recipe for the week so you can make it on your own and join us. You can register for the show, Biblioventures, Monsters and Ghosts, at rosenbach.org on the website. And tonight the cocktail is called Drinking Alone, which we're not. But this is a salute to Mr. Utterson. It's the third line of the third sentence of the book. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone. So, and Jobi has put this together. It is gin, Aperol, and cucumber, and you muddle the cucumber, and I add a little slice in there as well. It is absolutely delicious. And if you don't like it quite as sweet, some people don't like Aperol because it's a little too sweet for them. You can try it with Campari, and that's a little more on the bitter side, and that would work really well too. But here's to drinking alone with everyone else. Well, let me give a full introduction to our co-host for this episode. Paul M. Chapman has a long-standing fascination with the fog-shrouded world of the Victorian and Edwardian Gothic. He is the author of Birth of a Legend, Count Dracula, Bram Stoker, and Whitby. I have a copy. And an in-depth, I should hold it up longer so people can. There's several different versions of this. This is the one.
That's the very first one.
It is. There you go. So I'll have to have it signed one day. And this is an in-depth study of the Yorkshire fishing port's profound influence on Stoker's masterpiece, Whitby. And Paul has also written introductions to Dracula and The House by the Churchyard and In a Glass Darkly by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Paul has written on ghost story writer, the ghost story writer of all time, M.R. James. And in 2018, Paul, together with Mark Jones and Teresa Dudley, co-organized the Through a Glass Darkly M.R. James Conference in New York. Paul, I didn't know you then, but I knew that was going on because I listened to the great podcast to the Curious.
Oh, yes, because they came along and guested.
And so I think I've heard you years ago talking about that on that podcast, and I'm just making those connections now. Paul is also known for his work on Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle, co-hosts the Doings of Doyle podcast with Mark Jones. Paul was a co-host also on our subscription-only series for the Rosenbach, Sherlock Mondays, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Those of you who subscribe to that show have already met Paul. He is currently working on a book-length study of Conan Doyle and the Gothic, which I really love. I have my Doyle Gothic Tales from Oxford Press right behind me, the white one.
I see the Darryl Jones.
Jones one. I am very pleased to have not only you and your expertise on the show, Paul, but also a co-host who rivals my own beard. So this is the first time.
More out than down.
Yeah. Hey, but it works. So
and also with the kind of I think it's quite obvious my just love of the Victorian age, and but I dress like Mr. Utterson tonight, and you mentioned earlier about smoking. Well, I haven't got a pipe, but I do have the hat. If it's needed. Yeah,
I really need a smoking. Yeah, you've got the smoking jacket. I have a smoking jacket, but it'll get too warm if I wear it during the show. But I've always wanted a smoking hat.
They're very comfortable.
Yeah. And people think they're a fez, but they're not. A smoking hat is different than a fez.
Oh yes, totally different, and obviously designed for the purpose to soak up the smell of the smoke, so that it goes into your hat rather than your hair. So it is a functional item, but they look great as well.
It doesn't matter with me. I just smell like smoke every time I walk into a room. So. Well, and I love your. Are these mostly Doyle books behind you? Or?
It's mostly This is most of my my Sherlock and Doyle, part of my Sherlock and Doyle collection. But I thought in honor of the Jekyll and Hyde theme, the top row behind me here is some of my Stevenson collection.
Nice.
And I've just stuck the poster behind, which you can only see part of the wonderful German expressionist poster for the 1931 version of Jekyll and Hyde with the Frederick March. Ruben Mamoulian.
Yeah. My favorite. Yeah.
And
many people's favorite.
Stevensoniana as well.
Yeah. So there was a question in the chat. I just have to bring this one up. After you finish a book, do you move the tassel to the other side if you're smoking it? So
It can get in. Yes, you've just got to watch where you put it.
all righty. Well, what you can all expect from this show, especially if you're new, for Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, unlike our previous Biblio Ventures, we're not necessarily doing this one as a serial, meaning I hope you have read the entire book already, because, and I sent that out in the emails for everyone that registered. We're going to cover just a couple chapters at a time, 2 or 3 chapters at a time. They're all such short chapters too. Every episode. So there will, but we need to have the whole book. So there will be spoilers in a sense. If you haven't read the entire book yet and don't know what the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde is, then you're going to find out. And unlike the very first readers, and we're doing it this way because so much of what we learn later in the book has a bearing on how we analyze or just how we think about what happens in the earlier chapters. So that's why I think you should read the whole thing first. It's short. And if you're watching this recording and you're thinking like, oh my God, I haven't done that yet. Well, then stop the recording, go read the book and come back. It's real short. You can do it. When we do Charles Dickens as A Christmas Carol, we're going to do 6 episodes of for Jekyll and Hyde, and then we'll do 6 episodes on A Christmas Carol. When we do Dickens Christmas Carol, we'll actually follow the serial no spoiler method as we work through it one stave at a time. But for Jekyll and Hyde, the big reveal later in the book, I think, needs to be acknowledged to get the most out of these early chapters. So the co-hosts will rotate on this show. Paul is on this show. The next episode, Olivia Rottigliano. You may have met her on the last couple of Sherlock Monday special summer episodes that we did. Olivia will join us, and you can find and then we'll have on the very final episode 6, Leslie Klinger will be on the show with me to talk about the legacy of Jekyll and Hyde. And many of you know Les Klinger from all the great annotation editions he's done of Dracula and Frankenstein and Sherlock Holmes and Sandman and Lovecraft and many others. But he also has a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde annotated edition. And Les will be here as a co-host on that episode number 6 for Jekyll and Hyde. And the co-host schedule is also on the webpage, so you'll know which co-host you're coming to see. Paul, let's talk a little bit about Robert Louis Stevenson.
The reason we're here.
Yeah, but there's so much to get through tonight. Just when we set up a show, but we need to, before we start talking about the book, I think we do need to give a little bit of context on his life, how he came to create this novel, and maybe before that, we should talk about how to pronounce this title. For Stevenson and for everybody in Scotland, England, I think it's Dr. Jekyll, like Jekyll, Jekyll. That's the way the name is pronounced there, and that's the way it was pronounced, always there and still is there, I think, right?
I think Jekyll has kind of taken over here as well, because people do. I excuse me. I always pronounce it Jekyll, and people look at you a bit gone out when you pronounce it that way, because they say it's Jekyll, is it? No, it's Jekyll, and you always think of the famous gardener Gertrude Jekyll, and people never get confused with her name. But it's because of principally the Hollywood side of principally with the Spencer Tracy film from the 40s that introduced Jekyll, whereas the Frederick March film
in 1931, it's Jekyll.
Yeah, throughout. So it was there, and it's just changed, and you actually see confusion with people where we see it spelt with a C, Jeck, when people haven't seen it written properly, and they just presume it's got a C in it, Jekyll.
Yeah.
But certainly the pronunciation Stevenson favored was Jekyll. And
he mentions it in a letter that he writes to someone at one point, and he says, and he mentions that I don't have the exact quote, but he tells them that it should be pronounced Jekyll.
Mm,
So to rhyme, so Jekyll and Hyde
mm,
is like seek and hide, hide and
mm,
seek. So
mm.
he specifically mentions that in a letter later, that he liked that it sounds a little like hide and seek. So
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely the point that he wanted to make. And there was a spoof, I think it was Punch, just after the book had come out, they did a spoof about Dr. Treacle. So they obviously played on the joke that the people would get the joke because they'd know the actual pronunciation is Jekyll. But it's, I mean, either work. If you want to be a purist, it's Jekyll. But
uh,
it's entered popular culture
yeah,
out of Stevenson's control. So
I can't shake
yeah,
Jekyll. It's
yeah.
with Jekyll, my like I can't. And I thought like what I would do is maybe I would set up like a swear jar, but like it would be Jekyll. It would be a Jekyll jar, and every time I
Yeah.
said Jekyll, I would have to put some. But no, I can't. I'd go broke because I'm not going to be able to remember to all. It's always Jekyll.
Yeah, if you're brought up on a diet of the movies, yeah, Jekyll goes in, and you can't help saying it.
Yeah. And it's always when people sometimes get upset if or they don't like the fact that they may have mispronounced a word that they don't really know how to pronounce. But I always tell my kids this too, that no, that just means you're a reader. It
Yeah.
means that you've encountered these words reading, and there's no reason why you should pronounce it another way as you've heard it in your head. So
Mm,
be
mm,
ashamed to mispronounce something. It usually means you're a reader.
yeah.
Well, where do we start with? Well, he's Scottish, Robert Louis Stevenson,
Mhm.
but that's an important part of his life. That's the area of the kingdom that he is from, and grows up in a very staunch Calvinist. Or oh, no, his parents are Calvinists. It's just
It's the nurse,
the nurse is Calvinist.
Alison Cunningham, who really brings him up in a very strict, uh, very puritanical
Yeah,
form of religion, and very much the hellfire and damnation in a quieter way than a Roman Catholic way.
yeah,
It's still, it's the same sort of message, and filling a young boy's head with terrors and horrors.
yeah.
And
As especially as a sickly child, because
yes.
he's very sickly his entire childhood.
Mm,
He's rail thin his entire life. I mean,
mm,
skeletal. Some people describe him as. At
mm,
one point, he was like 109 pounds as an adult. Um,
mm.
and I don't know how tall he was, 5'8" ish, 5'10" ish, maybe even as tall as
I
that.
think he appeared taller than he was because he was very long
Because he was
limbed,
so thin. Yeah.
and obviously his thin stature just made him appear very, very tall.
But so sickly all his life, and as a child especially, he has this nurse, Allison Cunningham.
Mm,
Cummy is her name, as he always called her. And she would not only tell him all these, religious stories, and make him and get him to think about the salvation of his soul nightly. As you're going to bed, make
mm,
sure you're not going to hell tomorrow. Um, but also formed a really close bond with him. He winds up
mm,
dedicating his book of poetry, The Child's Garden of Verses, to her
mm.
as well.
I think it's important to make this point about her that she loved him.
Hmm.
She wasn't bullying him or hectoring him in a negative way. She thought she was doing good, and he loved her.
Yeah,
Uh, he didn't feel abused or anything by her. It's just almost this is the way it was, and it was a complex relationship, which would obviously be frowned upon nowadays. But I think it's a mistake to try and make some sort of villain out of her. That's
yeah, because
sure.
he doesn't see her as a villain ever,
No. Mm,
and he also gets from her this kind of just way of telling stories, perhaps,
mm, mm,
that that his parents aren't going to spend the time with him and tell him stories like she does. Actually, his
Mm.
father does when he's sick. He would
Yes.
tell him stories
Mm.
as well, sitting by the bed. But he really learns storytelling from her in a sense, as
Mm.
she's spinning all these, scary moral
Yes.
stories
Yeah.
to him.
Mm.
And the family, the Stevenson family, is also very famous in England and Scotland for creating all the lighthouses that they did along the coastlines of Scotland.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, the very, very noted engineering family, and so you got Stevenson's father Thomas, his uncle Alan was also a noted lighthouse builder, and yeah, this was it was a tough job. You know, they were very, very talented men, but also very tough men who would, they go out to these godforsaken islands
yeah,
to build these constructions. It's an amazing background. It's very, very odd background, really, you might think, for someone who becomes a writer. But there is also that point where in his youth he'd go out with his father
yeah.
it's a mini adventure. So it's another thing that's feeding into this imagination.
He's supposed to take up the trade. He's supposed to join the Stevensons in the family trade, and he never does. He never really takes to mathematics and engineering. But he does go with his father and then himself by himself sometimes to
Yes. Mm,
on these when they're building these lighthouses out, like miles from
mm,
shore on like a little outcrop of rocks where they've
mm,
got to, get everything out there and build it, and just incredibly dangerous and thrilling work. But also for him, it's something he was just not interested in doing and pursuing.
No, the thing it's he's observing, when he's out there with he's observing the lives of the men and the characters, and that's what he's picking up on, and getting his imagination fired by this, but his imagination is not fired by the engineering side of it in the slightest.
Yeah.
Mm.
I'm amazed too that I mean, I mentioned how sickly he was. He even called himself at one point in his life a professional sickist.
Yes.
That's how he refers to himself, because he's always ill.
Mm,
And later in life, it becomes this, lung diseases where he's constantly, coughing up blood.
mm,
Maybe tuberculosis, it may not be. It's never we're never quite sure what actually was going on, but it wasn't just that, like everything like would happen to him. He was going
mm,
blind, and he had, he would just have debilitating aches and pains and all his life. And in
mm,
spite of all that, he is such an adventurer, traveling across, France with the mountains of the donkey, going
mm,
to America later in life, across the South Pacific, and then finally ending up in Samoa and living there.
mm.
Um, Never, and going out to these lighthouses and just always adventuring for somebody who really was sickly. It's not like he wasn't sick. He was going and doing this stuff even while he was sick.
Yeah, and even from his youth, adventures in Edinburgh itself, and going out into he was very much a product of the new town, the bourgeois respectable
Mhm.
part of Edinburgh. But he was fascinated by the old town, the medieval Edinburgh, and would go, he'd go slumming basically. But he wasn't a middle class boy who looked down
Yeah.
on the
No.
people he found there. He was fascinated by them, and he loved them again in their way. He understood and saw the humanity in them. And so he never he felt a lot of his time, I think, guilt for his privilege.
Yeah.
And learned about their lives, and this is again what makes him such a sympathetic writer later
Mhm.
on, is he doesn't look down from his tower on anybody.
Yeah, these stories, and won't be able to give a complete picture or share all these details about him, but as this series goes on, we'll share more and more biography about him, and sometimes how it relates to his works. But I just wanted to set it up a little bit. But you mentioned one of the things I have to mention is that these excursions he would take into, the grimier, the more dangerous parts of Edinburgh,
Mm.
and and hang out and make friends with the prostitutes.
Yes, absolutely.
He's not just a customer. Like, it's not that he's not slumming in that way where he was going down and partaking of whatever you would do, but he would go down and become friends with people and hang out with them, and he seemed to enjoy their company more than the bourgeois middle class,
Yeah, he was. I mean, he's certainly one thing he wasn't towards them is patronizing,
yeah.
and in many ways he'd look at them as almost better people than him because they're he'd say they're more honest
Hmm.
than the people from his side of life. So I think he enjoyed their company for that. He enjoyed just the kind of straightforward lives that they lived, and obviously, again, felt sorry for them is the wrong way of putting it, but he had an empathy
Hmm.
with their lives, and as I say, didn't look down on them, didn't
Yeah.
patronize them, and
Yeah, it
was
comes across in how he writes
fascinated
about
by
them
them.
later. He writes
Mm,
about everyone that he meets. Yeah,
mm,
it really does. Um, well, another person that will come up as this series goes on is Fanny, um,
mm.
his wife, who he met when he was 27, I think, and she
Mm.
was 37 or
Yeah,
30.
she was 10 years, 10,
Yeah,
10, 11 years his
10
senior.
years 10 years older than him, and they immediately kind of fall for each other.
Mm.
She's still married. She's traveling in France, separated from her no good husband, but with her children into she has to bring her children with her. So she has her children. She's taking art classes in
Yes.
France,
Mm.
meets him. They fall for each other, but she is still married. There's nothing they can do about
Mm.
that. And they have this relationship for at least a year or so, and then she
Mm.
goes back to her husband in America and where she's from,
Mm.
and then she finally tells him that she could get a divorce, and he leaves and travels all the way to California, in which at time traveling to California was not
Yeah.
easy to get to from England, and then she does get a divorce, and they get married immediately, and then she becomes not just his wife but his caretaker for
Mm.
life because he is so sick all of the time. And this is the relationship they have back to England, living there, you're writing the Treasure Island and Jekyll and
Mm.
Hyde, and all the novels come then. But the relationship he has with her is very strong and very dedicated. The two of them. There's a brand new biography out on him too called oh, A Wilder Shore, which I haven't
Mm.
read yet. But I picked it up and I'll be reading this as it goes on. And
Mm.
it's basically it's Camille Perry wrote it, and it's basically it's a biography of the two of them
Yeah.
together.
Mm.
And so it's not necessarily just on him as a writer.
Mm.
And it will be interesting to see how how their relationship is portrayed. Many of his friends didn't like Fanny.
No, I mean this is through the earlier part of his life when he was starting to get his feet on the road as a writer.
Yeah.
That he became very friendly with Fanny Sitwell, who was a London literary lady, and her friend Sidney Colvin, who later became a Cambridge professor,
Hmm.
and they helped him enormously in his early steps in the literary world. But again, it's this kind of thing that you get with Fanny Osborne, like Fanny Stevenson. That again, it's this older woman, and he seems to have been drawn to these sort of women. Um, and
She was not the first married older woman that that he started to have a relationship with.
no, he seems to have been very
Yeah.
much. I mean, it's I don't know whether it's because of the way he's been brought up, and almost he had the extra mother with Alison Cunningham, and so on. So he almost always had to be mothered in a way,
Yeah.
despite his independent, adventurous character, and you get that. So this world that he builds up, the literary world that he builds up around Sitwell and Colvin, is very London centric and so on. And when I will go into all this later as the show goes on, I suppose with that they don't like Fanny. They find her an interloper. They find her, yeah, they find her vulgar,
Yeah.
sure, and pushy, and they don't like that, and they don't think that she fits in their world, and she's not good for Lewis, and it becomes complicated, and you get two camps building up, and he lives a very complex life.
Couple questions we'll hit, and then we'll talk a little bit about how he created the book. Somebody asks, how old was he when he died? Mary Lou wants to know, and he was
he was 44.
44. So and by his own estimation too, lived longer than he thought he was going to live.
Yes,
with the amount of ailments that he had. And then and dies the year it is. What year does he die?
1894.
Thank you. 1894. And Adam asks, how religious was Stevenson? That's interesting. My answer is, at core, he has absorbed all of this Calvinist religion, but as he has gone on to think about in his life, he doesn't believe in it in the same way, but he can't quite get rid of that original, you know. I was born and raised Catholic and went to Catholic schools all my life. You know what? That's always in me. Like I can't escape that, even though I am not Catholic now. I don't practice at all and don't believe in God. And so but I can't escape what I was given for so many years as a child. And I kind of read that in Stevenson as well.
Oh, definitely. It's because the seed that was sown by his parents and Alison Cunningham bore fruit in that, he understood religion. He was very interested in religion. He never, like I think, he never entirely lost it. He wasn't. I don't believe he was ever fully atheist in the kind of materialist scientific sense. But
he doesn't believe in heaven and hell.
He wasn't a believer either, and a lot of the influence, somebody else who will be mentioned later on, of his cousin Bob Stevenson, who caused a major upset between Lewis and his father, because Thomas Stevenson blamed Bob for corrupting his son and taking him off the path. And there's one part I think Lewis says about his father, to his father, I will not be called a careless infidel. So he doesn't like having the kind of atheist, unthinking atheist label thrown at him. So it's as with everything with Stevenson, it's complex.
Although I don't know, careless infidel on a business card, I might like that. Edward G. Pettit, careless infidel. I might be okay with that. Here's a question, and we should do this, and I didn't have it in my script, so we're going to do this before we move in. Before I show you guys pictures of the images of the Jekyll and Hyde that we have in our collection at the Rosenbach. Paul, how did you first come to experience Jekyll and Hyde, or perhaps Stevenson? I didn't ask you this ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, the actual Jekyll and Hyde itself, I would say it will have been through probably the Spencer Tracy movie as a boy will have been the one that I first saw. Then just got the idea, became interested in the idea as I became interested in the Gothic and the Victorian Gothic. It's there, and started watching too many Hammer movies and that kind of thing, and then went to the books. And it was Stevenson himself really began to fascinate me. It was the centenary year of his death, 1994, and the BBC did a wonderful two-part omnibus documentary called Stevenson's Travels, and I was just fascinated and really brought in, and they had all the right people talking about him: P.D. James, Richard Holmes, all the right, Frank McLean, all the right, the experts of that time. And I just thought, this is great. And so I began to explore his writings in a wider sense, and to read the biographies. And the one I would recommend to everybody actually is Richard Holmes's footsteps.
I just wrote it down because I've forgotten that I
Brilliant.
meant to reread that right now.
And
Yeah.
that took me where he really talks about the travels with the donkey in the Cevennes, and
Yeah.
that period when Stevenson was aching for Fanny, who'd gone back to America. And the whole program was put together so well. It just, I thought this man is absolutely fascinating, and he's not talked about enough.
Yeah.
He isn't given the status he deserves,
Yeah.
and is ripe for a proper rediscovery. That's for sure. Outside of the the two or three most famous books.
Yeah. I mean, I find that some of his short stories, and certainly Jekyll and Hyde, are kind of thought of as, kind of great literature now, but even Treasure Island should be. And
Mm.
I don't know about Kidnap because it's been too long since I've read it. I mean, I love to go back and read Kidnap. I'm
Mm.
assuming it's as good as it was as I remember it. But
Okay,
the other,
Kidnapped is great, and you just walk away from that book with this indelible image of Alan Breck,
yeah,
the Jacobite, and he's just wonderful. But it's also, if you want to study Stevenson, Kidnapped is a great book because David Balfour, the hero, is also, Stevenson doesn't shy away from making him a bit of a prig,
yeah,
and you've got that dichotomy of these two characters of Balfour and Breck. It's wonderful. And again, just sweeps you along. Stevenson and adventure. Just he knows how to do it.
he does. A brilliant writer, and I've always enjoyed him. I was probably introduced to at least Jekyll and Hyde from Abbott and Costello. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That has to be the first one I saw. I'm sure because I watched all the Abbott and Costello movies as a kid. They used to air on Sunday afternoons, and I was a big Abbott and Costello fan. I once knew all of Who's on First that I would do with a ventriloquist puppet. Uh, that but yeah, and so that's what I saw first, and then probably Spencer Tracy, the 41, and then seeing all the others and becoming a kind of a monster kid after that. Um, but it's always of his books, Jekyll and Hyde is the one that it had the biggest impact on me, and I taught it in college for years, and it just it yeah. I mean, I thought like 6 episodes I'm gonna do, and yeah, I could easily do 3 times that, talking about the issues and the ideas raised in this very small book.
Yeah. Mm. Oh, it's an incredible book.
All right, one little question. Did RLS and Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, know each other?
They didn't know each other, but they did correspond.
Yeah, there's some letters between them, and Doyle loved Stevenson as an author.
Yes, I mean it's. I mean, I've always again coming back to the Scottishness that you were talking about earlier with Stevenson. I always see a line of 4 Scottish writers. Walter Scott, Stevenson, Conan Doyle, and John Buchan, all following in the same tradition, and all feeding off one another. Scott is the root of this. But yeah, Doyle loved Stevenson's work, and Doyle's first great literary success, J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, which appeared in the Cornhill anonymously. It's a story about the Mary Celeste, and it was mistaken for something by Stevenson, which was a huge tribute to Doyle.
Yeah.
Was delighted with
Yeah.
this. And then when Stevenson was living in Samoa, he entered into a correspondence with him. And there's a wonderful point where Stevenson says about reading to some of the Samoans The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb, the Sherlock Holmes story, and he said, "Oh, you must forgive me, but I told it as if it was a true story." It's great stuff. They're having a lot of fun with each other in their letters.
Yeah. But at one point, I think does maybe Doyle get a little not annoyed, but Stevenson mentions like the Sherlock Holmes stories, and Doyle, they're not his favorite, or I can't remember. I'll have to look it up.
It's not. I think there is one thing, and which could be taken the wrong way, where Stevenson says the home stories they're the sort of stories I like to read when I've got a toothache.
There you go.
Which can be read in could ambiguous phrasing perhaps, but it's clear that the two admired each other, and Stevenson was also interested in spiritualism. And even at this stage, he knew that Doyle was getting interested in this stuff and addressed him as my fellow spookist. So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
I like that. There was a question in the chat, and I want to answer this now. Somebody wants to know how long this is going to go on. Well, the episodes go on for about 2 hours. This is long form content. That's what we do. And tonight we'll probably go a little longer. So, but hey, if you can't watch it all, that's okay. It exists on the Rosenbach's YouTube channel. You can always come back and finish whatever you didn't have time to watch earlier. So, we'll get a little bit of his conception of the story a little later when we're talking about the chapters, because then we have some dream things going on in chapter 2, and then that would be a good time to talk about Stevenson and dreams and maybe the inspiration for this book. So we'll save that till then, because I wanted to share. The Rosenbach has a first edition, and it's the first American edition of Dr. Jekyll, of the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's another thing for purists too, that it's not the strange case, it's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as if it's like a newspaper, headline or something, or from a story on the newspaper. All the chapter titles seem like they're like newspaper headlines, a remarkable incident of a letter, and as they would have written then. But here is let me share these images here. And this is just a case that it's held in, a clamshell box that the first edition is held in. Here it is, in very kind of plain green boards with gilt lettering, which is a little bit nice. And this first American edition preceded the London edition by just a few days. It's in New York. Scribner's is publishing it, and this actually comes out first, and then the London edition comes out. Scribner's in America issued 3,000 copies in wrappers, meaning a paperback version, and 1,250 in cloth. So this is one of those cloth copies. And this one, if you open it, there's again the binding, and I'll zoom in a little here. This one was owned by, and it's very faint, but I'm so I love to find owners' inscriptions in books. This is Clara Freeman, Cleveland, Ohio, December 1889. So that's who owned this copy. We have in our collection, we have Clara's copy of Dr. Strange Case of, and then the title page doesn't have it. The half title page, just has Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then here's the cover, or the title page, authorized edition. I mean, we're at the period now where the international copyright laws are just really going into effect, and being enforced in the 1890s. And but it's still not unusual for many pirate editions to appear of pirate editions for somebody who wrote Treasure Island to appear. But this is the authorized edition that Scribner's is paid for, and Stevenson gets a cut for, and by the same author. Look, there's a lot. He's published a lot by this point. Inland Voyage, a book about Edinburgh, Travels with a Donkey, book of essays, Virginia Vesperisque, Familiar Studies of Men and Books. They're kind of critical essays on authors. The New Arabian Nights, which is short fiction. Probably mentioned all that. Treasure Island, Silverado Squatters, that's his travel over in California, I think.
That was the honeymoon.
Yeah.
One about his honeymoon with Fanny, yeah.
Child's Garden of Verses, poetry specifically written for children, and Prince Otto, and then with Mrs. Stevenson, more Arabian Nights, The Dynamiter, which was a short novel about kind of Fenian dynamite terrorists in I think London. But Prince Otto, which was the book really right before this that had come out, people thought was going to be his or he put it out as his I'm writing an adult novel now after I've become so popular with Treasure Island. And it didn't go over so well. Nobody seemed to like it, and I'm not even sure Stevenson really liked it in the end.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's I think you go to it now with the expectation of a kind of Prisoner of Zenda Ruritanian romance.
Yeah.
And instead you get political philosophizing through a lot of and so you think, where's the adventure? You expect an adventure in Europe, and it doesn't emerge that way.
You have to wait for Anthony Hope for that, for
Yes.
Prisoner of Zenda. So that's when you get that story. There was the British edition, and people are more familiar with the cover of this. We do not have this in the Rosenbach's collection, but here it is a picture of it because it's just this lovely cover that's really arresting. And it is the lettering, I mean, different fonts all throughout, and the decorations and how they move here. They seem to be moving along. And it's interesting, and it's paperback. It's and it's interesting here because you see the 6 here in 1886 has been written over. Somebody has written the 6 over a 5. All of the copies have that. It was misprinted as 5, so they just had someone or a group of people write a 6 over the 5 for every first edition. I wonder if any of them were not caught. And I wonder if out there, I've never seen one, if there's one that just says 18. That would have to be the most valuable ever if someone missed it. But also note that it's 1 shilling. And because it's a thriller kind of horror adventure, that means it's a shilling shocker, as they were called, or just a shilling novel was sometimes a term of denigration for books like this. But this was reviewed well, despite it being a shilling shocker, wasn't it, Paul?
Oh yes, yeah. It was. I think it was realised pretty early that this is a cut above. This isn't just any old horror story. I mean, Stevenson did have an eye on the commercial market with this one, but
he did, and he knew that this was a story he could make money on that would sell well.
Yeah, but without lowering his own literary goals. And as you've just said, and we'll see constantly throughout this whole series, there's so much going on in this book. So many ideas are being thrown into it, which your standard penny dreadful or shilling shocker, they don't do that.
Yeah. Well, we will share more. I will share more items from our collections at the Rosenbach. Dr. Rosenbach, our founder, collected and sold manuscripts and first editions of Stevenson. He also Dr. Rosenbach once also purchased what is now called the notebook draft of Jekyll and Hyde, which was an incomplete draft manuscript of the story, was once in Dr. Rosenbach's collection, or maybe the inventory for the Rosenbach company. It was later sold. Dr. Rosenbach bought it for $1,750 in 1927. Less than $2,000. He, in that same auction in 1927, he also bought the manuscript of a poem by Stevenson called Ticonderoga, A Legend of the West Highlands. It's a long ballad. Paid $3,000 for that. Who reads Ticonderoga now, right? But it speaks to what collectors in 1927 thought would be valuable. Poetry from an author is valuable. What, this shilling shocker? This isn't going to be that. And it was only a partial part of the manuscript. And it's the earlier draft. There's another manuscript that is in the that's at Harvard, No, it's not at Harvard. It's at Yale. Is it? I can't remember where the other one is. Anyway, the manuscript that Dr. R purchased is now, that one's at Yale. That's in the Beneke Rare Book Library at Yale University. It's not at the Rosenbach. I wish we still had the manuscript for that, but the company did later sell it. But we still have the Ticonderoga manuscript. There's another larger printer's draft of Jekyll and Hyde, which is a later draft and which has notes in it, and then was probably the one that the printer had, and Stevenson was still making corrections on it. That one's in the Morgan Library. But Dr. Rosenbach not only collected Stevenson himself and then sold them and helped other collectors with them. He also helped Harry Elkins Widener, who was a book collector and also died on the Titanic along with his father, but was a famed book collector in the early 20th century, and had put together a great Stevenson collection, which went to Harvard after he died. And Dr. Rosenbach wrote and published a bibliography of Widener's collection. So we also have in our collection, we have a photo album which belonged to one of the cousins of Stevenson, and it has some photos of him when he's a child in it. We have several first editions. We have manuscripts, including, and this I would definitely share in one of the later episodes, a fragment of an autobiography, and specifically talking about the time that he was kind of slumming it in Edinburgh. So we have that in there. We have two first editions of Deacon Brodie, the play he wrote with his friend W.E. Henley. And both are inscribed by Stevenson. And that's all I'll say, because I'll share them in our future episodes. And there are a couple really interesting inscriptions on those. A reminder right now that anyone can visit the Rosenbach to see our collections. We make the Rosenbach makes this library of fine and decorative arts collections available for research by anyone. While approximately half of our researchers are traditional scholars, academic faculty, graduate students, we also welcome younger students or teachers, artists, writers, librarians, collectors, curators, dealers, and anyone with an inquiring mind. If you want to come to the Rosenbach and see our notes, Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula, or James Joyce's, manuscript for Ulysses, or Robert Louis Stevenson's, you can do that. You can just go to rosenbach.org and see how to make a research appointment and come visit this stuff yourself. You don't have to have certain credentials or anything like that. Our library is open for anybody to come and explore. All right. Well, before we do the story, let's just do this quick mid-break then, in which I thank everyone for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to fellow Biblioventures worldwide. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and this show by donation, which you can do so at our website, or by becoming a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, exclusive invitations to member-only events, and early access to registration. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website, and we have a special offer running right now for new members. If you become a member on the date that a show airs, one of these Biblioventure shows airs, you will receive an additional month added to your membership. That's 13 months. So there's lots of great in-person programs and courses available now at the Rosenbach. You can go on our website to find out about those. And we also have a Facebook group page, Biblioventures, Monsters and Ghosts. You can look it up on Facebook for lots more info, news, links, conversation, and fun about the stories we're covering. We've had Facebook group pages for every Biblioventure we've done, and they've always been very, very active and remain active after the shows stop airing live. So that's a lot of fun that we have there. And you can always write to me at epettit, Pettit, at rosenbach.org. I love to hear from our audience. And let's get to the book. We had a lot of setup today. I I think in future episodes, we'll be getting to the chapters pretty quickly. But we had some setup. So the first episode's always a setup. We've shared a PDF of a facsimile of this book. It's actually not entirely a facsimile, it's the first few pages and then the text, but a PDF of the entire book on our website. But also I put little PDFs of the chapters we're doing each week, if that's just easier for you to know this is exactly what we're doing. That's all on the Biblio Ventures Monsters and Ghosts web page. The title, Paul, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's, as I mentioned before, it almost sounds like a newspaper headline. But there's also the idea that it's only in the 19th century that case comes to be used for investigations into criminal behavior. The word case for centuries had been used already in legal proceedings. A lawyer would have a case, but now that there were professional police and detectives investigating and compiling evidence, case comes to be used for their work as well. And I think with detective story being developed in the late 19th century, a case then comes to mean a mystery to be solved.
And it also, with Stevenson's background in Edinburgh, it also has that medical.
The medical side too, yeah.
Which obviously ties in with Dr. Jekyll. So it's got a number of different meanings, and again, like with so much of this, works on a number of different levels. I mean, Conan Doyle did the same thing with some of the Sherlock Holmes stories, with those being cases, and Holmes is a consulting detective, like a consultant doctor. So it's that Edinburgh background, I think, is really also making itself felt in the.
For people that don't know too, Edinburgh is it's a major capital for. I mean, it's the School of Medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and that's which is extraordinarily famous at the time. I mean, it's not the only school for medicine, but it's certainly one of the most prominent.
Yeah, it's really seen as a kind of center of excellence.
Yeah,
at that time, and Edinburgh itself is kind of suffused with this almost medical atmosphere. Medical students, you'd encounter them everywhere in the pubs and so on. So again, Stevenson is because he's studying engineering and later law at the university, he's also knocking about with members of the medical faculty, and again, a connection to Conan Doyle.
Who went to medical school there? Yeah,
he also trained there, and obviously Sherlock Holmes was partly based on Dr. Joe Bell, who was one of the famous teachers there, and when Stevenson first read Sherlock Holmes, he actually said to Conan Doyle, "Is this my old friend Joe Bell I see before me?" So the medical world was very very obvious in Edinburgh, and so that definitely comes into this title as well.
And this in the late 19th century also, there becomes this explosion in cases and case studies of patients suffering from either physical or mental difficulties that are published in journals that not just medical professionals read, but that people just interested in these sciences read. And this book itself is actually kind of a collection of documents that A, solve a mystery, and B, provide a case study of a scientific experiment, right? So it kind of, I think for 19th century readers, when this book comes out, I mean, they understand it's a novel, that they understand that it's fiction, but it puts them in the mindset of we're reading these kinds of things that are also being published in journals. There is also a dedication to this, and let me share I'll share the picture of that. On the dedication page, it is to Catherine Dematos. Can you read that when you read that, Paul? Your accent's better than mine. Can you? Is it bigger?
Right. I'll be easy for me if I read it out of copy I've got, if I can find the dedication. After the introduction. There we go. To Catherine de Matos. It's ill to loose the bonds that God. Sorry. It's ill to loose the bonds that God decreed to bind. Still will we be the children of the heather and the wind, far away from home. Oh, it's still for you and me that the it's very small writing, that the broom is blowing bonny in the North Country. So it's very much it's Stevenson.
Who is she?
Sorry, Catherine is a cousin of Stevenson. I've mentioned Bob Stevenson earlier, who was the cousin that Thomas Stevenson regarded as a bad influence on Lewis,
and also was a very close friend.
Very close, one of his closest friends of youth. And Catherine was Bob's sister, and she was a very close friend as well. And Lewis would spend time with the family. They were also atypical as the children of the engineering family. I mean, their father Alan had actually suffered a mental collapse.
Many of the Stevenson, elders, this seems to happen to them. So
yes, yeah, there's this. I mean, Lewis's own father Thomas was pretty close at times.
Yeah.
And particularly with the behavior of his son, which drove him to despair at times and drove him, to the edge of madness. Whereas Alan actually did have to give up his career. And Bob, as we've said, he was a bit of a wild character. And again, he like Lewis, he had that artistic strain was stronger in him. And Catherine, as Bob's sister, knew about their adventures and sometimes joined in their adventures, and was artistic herself. And she later, I mean, there would be a controversy.
Well, before that, even when this is published, we'll get to the controversy in a minute, because she separates from her husband, and then she winds up having to support herself and her two children as a writer, and RLS gives her access to his own funds for her to support herself. So they're very close, and he's very involved in her life as she is in his.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a full letter that came up that he sent to her with the dedication, and this is in the Klinger annotated. Dearest Catherine, here on a very little book and accompanied with lame verses, I have put your name. Our kindness is now getting well on in years. It must be nearly of age, and it gets more valuable to me with every time I see you. It is not possible to express any sentiment, and it is not necessary to try, at least between us. You know very well that I love you dearly and that I always will. I only wish the verses were better, but at least you like the story. And it is sent to you by the one that loves you, Jekyll and not Hyde, RLS. I love that final signature there. But very close they are. And I think in that little dedication too, it really highlights their connection to Scotland. This kind of
oh yes, very much the into heather and so on, and
the broom. The broom is the Scots broom, which is a plant for people that might not know. And when it says the broom is blowing bonny, that means the broom plant is flowering well. Also, and this is we'll get to the point you were going to make. Catherine was very close to Stevenson's friend William Henley, who wrote plays with Stevenson, including Deacon Brodie, which will get mentioned during these episodes at some point. But there was a falling out. This is the controversy you were going to mention.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it all revolves around Fanny Osborne and Fanny Stevenson. where Catherine at one meeting of the friends was discussing a story idea. And it's about a meeting on a train, and Catherine had the idea that a fey young woman would meet a man on a train, and the story would pan out that the young woman was a lunatic. And Fanny interjected with, "Wouldn't it be better if she was, I think, some sort of fairy sprite or water sprite?" And Catherine seems to have been, gosh,
Authors love that when you tell them how they could make their story better.
yes, so she wasn't impressed. And then in March 1888, I think it was, a story called The Nixie appeared, written by Fanny Stevenson, which seems to have been this story reworked. And W.E. Henley really went to war over this.
Yeah.
And he took Catherine's side. It put
in letters. These are all
Yes.
letters back and
Yeah,
forth.
there's no fisticuffs.
We have, but it also means that we have a record of it. Well,
Yes, so we know this actually happened, and happened as it did, and it just led to a major split. It did lead to Lewis and Henley falling, and they had been very close friends.
Yeah.
And it led to them falling out because Lewis had to leap to the defense of Fanny, even though he knew she wasn't exactly in the right, but it was his bounden duty. And very difficult for him because therefore, it causes a rift with Henley and with Catherine de Matos.
Yeah.
And it's all a very, very painful business for all concerned. So that's nearly 3 years after Jekyll and Hyde is published. And so the dedication has an extra poignancy later on, and that this is coming up along the line.
But for now, he's dedicated it to his favorite cousins, who's shortly before he writes it, she's on a trip with him where they're trying to travel, and he gets so sick and he can't move, and Fanny and Catherine is so kind of almost horrified by the way that Fanny has to pick him up, literally, like he's a child, place him on a bed and then turn him over. And so she's privy, as all of his friends were, to his ailments and the care that had to be given to him at times when he was, when he couldn't take care of himself.
And it shows as well with that dedication. He obviously felt that Jekyll and Hyde was an important book and knew it was an important book. And so the fact he's dedicated it to Catherine shows the strength of the bond.
Yeah.
But also it's just a sign of the closeness of these two, and how important she is to him, and how important this book is. The fact that he picks her to dedicate it to shows that he thinks highly of the book.
Chapter 1. Story of the door. Is it or the? What is it? It's story. Why did I just misremember that suddenly? It is Story of the Door. We start with a door. And that is so important in this book. Doors are so important. So are keys. Doors and keys are very important in this story. I mean, figuratively. I mean, metaphorically, and the meaning that they convey in the text. We will pay special attention to doors and how characters are always trying to open them, get at what's behind them, then perhaps regretting that they opened those doors. And this happens all through. I mean, more on doors in a moment when we really get to it, but first we get a description in the book of not a door, but a character, Mr. Utterson, Gabriel John Utterson. We later learn his full name is, and Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. That's a little bit daring. Like, I'm going to tell you, this guy who is so dreary and dusty and never smiles, but he's somehow lovable.
Mm.
Is the way. It doesn't sound like somebody you'd want to hang out with. Um, and then to make that, to really drive that home, he was austere with himself when he was at home, and he drank gin when he was alone, drinking alone, to mortify a taste for vintages. That is so strange. And I used to struggle over, like, what does that mean? Now, what I've come up with, and I think this is true, what it means is he drinks gin, the cheap, for him, like cheap gin. This is not elevated. I have this nice gin that I'm drinking that I made this cocktail with. No, gin is like the cheapest alcohol that you could get then. And he drinking gin, so he won't, so it'll ruin his taste buds, so he won't spend his money on expensive wines. Meaning he wants expensive wines, but needs to find a way to not then have those pleasurable things, in a sense. Right? He's also he had an improved tolerance for others, but also an envy at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds. Um, I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. Um, that's all fun to say that, but as we go through this story, we'll find out it's really true that, that he's the kind of person that will ignore, or not ignore, will cover up the worst things about people and be okay with them, as long as, kind of proprieties can be, followed.
And it's part of his profession.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's his bread and butter is to, it helps his profession, obviously, if he allows people to behave as they will, because it will bring him work, and he also knows how to be discreet enough,
Yeah,
to cover up there.
I think too that, I mean, especially for a Victorian reader, this kind of, the Cain's heresy, which is in this, not to, is to not let my brother, or let my brother go to the devil. For a Victorian reader, especially, I can't help but think, as people, especially people who are so immersed in religious sayings, would not contrast that with the brother part, with the Jesus is, inasmuch as ye have done unto one of the least of my brethren. Ye have done unto me. The golden rule: do unto others, you do unto me. Do unto others as you would have do unto you. What he's saying is the opposite of that. Like, just do whatever you're going to do, what you're going to do, and I'm not going to be involved in it. And that's not this isn't a strongly moral character, is, I think, what happens in this opening paragraph. And we'll find out more why as this goes on. Then we meet Enfield, Mr. Richard Enfield, a distant kinsman, and a well-known man about town. So, man about town, fashionable, someone who mixes with society, but maybe perhaps a little rakish, is, I think, in that,
Yeah, he's. I mean, this is a club man, and I think we're given the idea that he's a bit of a flaneur sort of character.
Yeah.
Enjoys parading around town, watching other people, and just watching life, and enjoying watching life. But he is also a part of that life, and you get this interesting. I find fascinating the later addition to that about him, where we find out, the first adventure almost. And I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning.
Yeah.
It's
3 o'clock in the morning?
What's he up to? It's it's 3 o'clock in the middle of winter. I was just coming home. What does this man do? And the joy is that it's not filled in.
Yeah.
It's up to you to join the dots and say, here's this character, man about town. He's out till 3 o'clock in the morning doing God knows what. So
Late night drinking at the club,
it could
or
just coming home from his club, or
visiting other places.
Mm,
We should bring this in now. We were going to bring this in later, but
mm,
because this chapter's part is here now, it's
mm,
where they are is down a by street in a busy quarter of London. There's a thriving trade there, but the streets shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood, like a fire in a forest. And then there's this sinister block of building that thrusts toward forward its gable on the street, and then we'll get to the door. But it's set in London, and
mm,
I remember a time many years ago when I thought this book was set in Edinburgh. Like
mm,
I thought that, like in my, like I think I was like, and because I know this is true because at one time I was reading it and I was like, oh wait, it's in London,
mm.
and I always thought it was in Edinburgh. But that's not an uncommon mistake to make with this, is it?
No, it's. I mean, it's the whole way it's presented. It doesn't feel like London. And when you know the background that Stevenson's an Edinburgh man, and that he knew Edinburgh through and through, the new town and the old town. This is what you're getting here. You're getting two faces, whereas London has multiple faces. Whereas it's easier with Edinburgh to tame it into
Yeah.
two obvious faces represented by the new town, the bourgeois new town,
Yeah.
and the working class, rather raffish medieval old town. And this is what you are getting in here, and you feel that Mr. Enfield he would fit into the world of the West End club, but he also feels like someone who would fit very well into that world that we talked about, the legal and medical world
Mhm.
of Edinburgh, which is the world that he's moving in this
Yeah.
book. So it's got that feel about it, and it's also it's a kind of, or even at the start we're getting this semi-fantastic location, and this imaginary London, and because Stevenson's from Edinburgh, it's got more of Edinburgh. He was never really a London man. And so he's looking at Edinburgh,
Yeah.
and you get this well, in the following year with Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes novel, which is also Edinburgh disguised as London, from another Edinburgh exile with
Mhm.
Conan Doyle, and so you've got that definite, the clear dichotomy with Edinburgh, which I don't think you do get with London, because London is so
Tell people
multifarious.
a little bit about that. Why that duality of Edinburgh, the old town, the new town is what, early 19th century it's built, isn't it?
It's developed in the I think the late 18th, early 19th century, and built very much on
That's
a
what I meant. 19th, yeah, it's in
yeah
19,
on a grid pattern, and with wide thoroughfares, and
very
it's much
wide streets, all
cleaner,
new
and
buildings.
it's all planned. I mean, it's funny with Lewis himself, actually, when he talks about it, he said, yeah, it's all very nice, but they built it facing the wrong way as regards to the sun and so on, and so it's still got that gloom, but it's finer and fresher than the other side of
The
the
old
city.
town is up against the
It's
castle's on
it's
a giant
Yeah, you've got the
rock
castle, you've got
hill,
Arthur's Seat. It's
and
it's
then
very medieval. I mean, even now, it's a wonderful place to go exploring, because you've got these the wines and the closes, and you go up stairways between in alleys, and it's a really, you can romanticize it with ease.
and it was built up because they didn't have room, so all the buildings they just kept
They
going
go, yes,
higher.
and occasionally collapsed
Yeah.
on themselves. So that's this kind of higgledy-piggledy world that's just it's organic and has just developed, whereas the new town is the opposite to that. It's solid, and it's inhabited by the bourgeois.
And which is where Stevenson lives as a
That's
child.
where he's grown up and rebels against.
Yeah, when he's
This is
attracted to the old town.
him and Bob are, kicking against that
Yeah.
sort of world. and Stevenson, the romantic side of Lewis is coming out
Yeah.
with that exploration of that, and that's all there in Jekyll and Hyde, from the start. I think you're getting that atmosphere fed to you straight away.
I've several critics I've read about this book talk about how he's really writing about Edinburgh.
Mm.
It's not it's a lot of people read this and see Edinburgh in it.
Mm.
The way he's describing the place.
He uses to an extent as well with the earlier book, The New Arabian Nights, which is also set in, it's more identifiably London in The New Arabian Nights, but still it's what Jorge Luis Borges called fairy London,
Yeah.
which he says Stevenson invented basically in The New Arabian Nights. It's this fantastical version of London, which again Conan Doyle builds on with the London of Sherlock Holmes, and you get this with Arthur Machen's London in The Great God Pan and The Three Impostors. And again, Doyle and Machen are both hugely influenced by Stevenson, and The New Arabian Nights in particular really begins to build this world. And so there's an element of that coming into Jekyll and Hyde as well. But I think Jekyll and Hyde has that stronger Edinburgh feel than The New Arabian Nights. It's again, it's quite interesting where you've got the dedication to Catherine de Matos, because he's obviously thinking back with the nostalgic poem, and I think Edinburgh is on his mind at this time, so it's getting into the book in a very strong way. And this is a book about Edinburgh, and it's the social side of Edinburgh, and as we'll go into, the hypocrisies of Edinburgh.
You mentioned Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, who loves Stevenson and wrote about him. We're having a course on Borges at the Rosenbach, online course. If you're watching live, registration is open, starts in a few weeks. But there's also a story about a door, or at least titled that, and the door features in that in New Arabian Nights, right? The Sir Malajouaz.
Well, it's a standalone. The Sire de Malatoire's door.
Yeah.
Which is probably, I think, 1878, 79, set in the 15th century. And it's a young man has an adventure in, I think it's a French city, and he's escaping from a group of drunken men-at-arms. And he's noticed this mysterious door, and he pushes it open, goes in, and it clicks behind him, and he's shut in. And he's been brought into this trap by the Sire de Malatoire, who insists that he marries his daughter. And it just becomes this very odd adventure. But this whole idea of the door, and once you enter the door, it shuts behind you, and you're entering a new world, and your life is going to change. So he's obviously very fascinated by doors and what's behind them.
Well, and especially in this story, I mean, the building, the building is sinister itself, and he literally uses that word, and it says, it was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The forehead really keys you in, that really, embodying this building with the sense that there's human qualities to it. And of course, that's the metaphor that's going on here, that inside this building is, inside of Henry Jekyll's, being, and that, that you wind up learning later. But the door itself was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Neither bell nor knocker, meaning there's no welcoming way to say, can I come in? You just have to open it, or I guess pound on it, to tell people that you want to come in. Door is, the word door occurs 58 times in this book. Okay. 17 times in the first 2 chapters, door. It's all over the place. And that's really a lot of mentions for something that really is so kind of present in regular life that you generally don't need to mention its use or mention its existence. So I think Stevenson winds up bringing it to our particular attention And basically it's a character saying, hey, look at this door, let me tell you a story about this door. It's whether Stevenson is intentionally doing it or it's part of his conception of the story, so it just naturally hits there that he winds up keep mentioning a door. I think it will come to be important as we go through the story.
I think you've also got with that description of the building, it's a diseased building,
Yeah,
very much so, and it is
as Jekyll is.
yes, it's giving you the hints are all starting to appear.
I mean,
This is
later
a
we'll see this. There's an inner courtyard, like an inner
mm,
person, and there's a one front to it that's nice, and then this
mm,
one part that's not so nice, and even this part was an old operating theater, old anatomical theater, and so there's a lot going on here that we'll wind up unpacking as we go through. This is just the introduction. When he mentions the door, did you ever remark that door is connected in my mind with a very odd story? And then, indeed, said Mr. Utterson, with a slight change of voice. And what was that? And the slight change of voice is that he knows whose door this is. Now, we don't know that as the reader doesn't, the first reader doesn't know that, but later, very soon after this, we find out that, oh, he knows the door that he's talking about right away. He lets Enfield tell him a story without letting him know that,
mm.
wait, I know whose door this is. I know that it's the back door to Jekyll's. So
I think the phrasing as well with Enfield's character is again this the whole Stevensonian use of language. Did you ever remark that door? It's just the way it's said is just it's wonderfully almost louche clubman. Just it's just brilliant.
thank you. I like that. Um, well, he has a story about it, and the story is, well, I think the same thing happens to Utterson and how he dreams about this story. And it's also the way, it's usually filmed or people talk about the story. Oh yeah, Jekyll, he like tramples this little girl. Well, he does. At 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, a little man stumping along, a girl maybe 8 or 10 was running, and then the horrible part of the thing, the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground, like some damned juggernaut. Um, and then he chases after her, and then a bunch of people come to the screaming child. And it turns out that she's kind of okay. um that she's not really hurt. It says uh they the child was not much the worse, more frightened, but Enfield says I had taken a loathing to my gentleman, so had the child's family. And then the doctor comes because apparently this girl, it just mentions the girl was coming back from a doctor. So this is why the little girl is out at 3 a.m. She was sent to a doctor for some reason, medicine for a family or something. And then the doctor shows up with a strong Edinburgh accent. So there you go. He's throwing the Edinburgh doctor in here. And then even the doctor, the Sawbones, turns sick and white with the desire to kill him. And Hyde, and he hasn't named Hyde yet. This is Hyde. And Enfield says, killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told him we would make such a scandal that would make his name stink from the end of London. If he had any friends and any credit, he would lose them. We were keeping the women off him because they were wild as harpies and wanted to get him. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle with a kind of black sneering coolness, frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. And then we screwed him up to 100 pounds for the child's family, meaning they told him you're going to pay 100 pounds. In the manuscript, it's 1,000, their first manuscript. And then I guess Stephen's like, yeah, that's a little much. So it's 100 pounds. And they make him pay. Hyde's afraid, but he's cool under pressure. He's trampled on this girl, bumped into her and stepped on her, and she got hurt, but then she's got up and she's fine. Um, but but he hasn't really, like, in I think in many people's memory, this is a horrid incident that happens, and really it's not a big deal. And actually, the only people who do anything wrong here are the people who blackmail him to cover it up. Um, it's one of those scenes that when you reread it and really look at what's happening, um, it winds up, it's the hypocrisy at work throughout the novel, right? Um, uh, Hyde says he'll pay them, and then they do, and then it's funny that they have to kill hours in between, so they all go to Enfield's house and they even have breakfast. Like, I want that scene. I want the scene where you're having breakfast, Mr. Hyde, waiting for the bank to open. Um, and Enfield even says to Utterson that, well, he goes in and gets the check. He goes in and gets a check. He comes out with 10 pounds in gold and a check. And the check is signed by Henry Jekyll, we now know. But he says, I will stay with you until the bank opens and cash the check myself. And Enfield says, it's a bad story. For my man was a fellow that nobody would have to do with, a really damnable man. This is Hyde he's talking about. And the person that drew the check, who the check he was cashing, is the very pink of the proprieties, celebrated too. And what makes it worse? One of your fellows who do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. This will come up again and again. Blackmail House is what I call the place, with the door in consequence. Though even that, is far from explaining all. And Paul, the fact that Enfield thinks that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll, and that's why Jekyll has to pay for his crimes. Who's doing the blackmailing?
Well, it's yes, you've already got, as you've said, this is a book that primarily is about hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And you've got this, it is this kind of, they've all taken this instant dislike, and we're going to get this man. We don't like him.
Yeah.
We don't know why we don't like. We just don't like him, and we're going to get him. And then when you find out about the involvement of their friend, oh, we're really going to get him. But you've got a number of strange things going on here. I mean, as you said, there's this. It's always struck me as odd going back to Enfield's rooms, and what did they do in that time? And they say they loathe Hyde, yet he's happy to let him in. Did they talk about it, or did they just sit sullenly? I just, like you said, love to picture what's going on there. But you've also got, I mean, with things that strike me where you've mentioned with the Doctor, and this is where they use him as an example of the way he reacts to Hyde, and the way that Stevenson describes the Doctor is great. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent and about as emotional as a bagpipe. It's a wonderful phrase there. You've got that. So he's the one. He's getting excited and disliking Hyde. So you got this sense of the dislikability of Hyde, and I think it's also telling with the what Enfield says about Hyde being frightened but carrying it off, like Satan.
Yeah.
Already we're getting that kind of Hyde demonized in all this way. But as you say, he's done this thing. He hasn't apologized for it after it. But it's not like he's attacked the girl.
Yeah.
What he hasn't done is stopped, picked her up, and apologized.
Yeah.
But the way they're reacting, it's almost like he's deliberately almost kicked her when she's on the ground.
Or he violently attacked her, and she's really injured, and basically he bumped into her and hurt, and then she's okay. But they really go into her. I should mention, we also have the mention of the key here too, because he's when they get him to pay, the next thing was to get the money. And where do you think he carried us? But to that place with the door.
Mm.
Whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with a matter of 10 pounds of gold. So he has a key. Hyde is the one who has the key to this secret residence and has access to the door that no one else has access to. Enfield winds up saying that well, Utterson asked him, have you ever asked about the place with the door? And he says, no, I had a delicacy. I had a delicacy. I have no delicacy about telling a man that I'm going to ruin you for life unless you pay money. But I do have a delicacy about asking, about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the day of judgment. You start a question and it is like rolling a stone. And he says, the next thing you know, the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine. The more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask. Now, I so wish Queer Street meant what it would mean now, but it doesn't. It is it's real. People in difficulties live on Queer Street, the street where things are going wrong, they're not quite right, especially financial decisions. So it has nothing to do with being gay yet. That definition doesn't hit until even, I think, until well into the 20th century. But Utterson is questioning Enfield about this so far unnamed person. Well, this unnamed person who might own the house, because he knows it's Jekyll's home. He knows it's the back door to Jekyll's home. And he wants to know if it's Jekyll without asking if it's Jekyll, right? So he's like, oh, did you know? Have you ever seen here? Do you know who this is? He wants to find out if, you know, he wants to make sure that Enfield maybe knows and without asking. So, but Enfield doesn't want to pry into people's lives. But he's continued to watch the house.
Like, I find this is fascinating from the kind of detective story perspective.
Yeah.
One, you've got Enfield saying that this about I don't like to pry into it roll stones and this kind of idea of the professional detective appearing at this time, and people don't like the professional detective for precisely this sort of reason. They're prying into people's lives. They're opening books of people's lives that shouldn't be open.
And they dress in plain clothes. You don't even know that it's a policeman because they're in plain clothes. People are very it's like they're spies in our lives. That's the first reaction to police detectives, is people think they're spies. We can't have them. Yeah, and that's I think that's all in here. But he says, I have studied the place for myself. Once in a great while, he sees Hyde go in again, and the chimney's smoking, so I know someone's there. I mean, he's really keeping an eye on this place afterwards. He hasn't let it go. He continues to want to know more. And this is when Utterson asks his name, and he says, it's Hyde. What sort of man is he to see? Because Utterson not only knows that that's Jekyll's door, he knows who Hyde is, because he's the lawyer for Jekyll's will. Hyde's in the will. This is why he's really, he has to find, I'm like, oh, it's Hyde. I have to find out who this person is now, because he's upset that this will has this. We'll get to that in the second chapter. And then this is this is a brilliant way that Stevenson has done this, right? This description of Hyde that everybody gives of Hyde, that nobody can quite give the details of his, countenance. For Enfield, it says, there's something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him, and it's not want of memory, for I declare I can see him this moment. This inability for Utterson will happen with him later too. That people can't quite describe what he looks like, but there's something about deformity about him. Is a really fascinating way, and I think it makes it seem, especially for the seem more evil, like there's something satanic going on here.
It's very, very clever that you get with after the initial incident, people can't explain why they dislike him, and then he can't be described.
Yeah.
And it is again leaving a lot to the reader. And this is, I think, where the film's struggle is. How are we going to depict him? So
because you have to depict him.
Depictions of him which actually are very different from what Stevenson's describing, and we get various, as we go through the book, various descriptions of Hyde, and he's faintly ludicrous, in his appearance at times, as well as being frightening to people. And it's just the way Stevenson plays this, I think, is enormously clever. And again, his use of language, downright detestable. He does. I noticed this earlier with he likes his alliteration at times, and when it works very strongly. It's just all very cleverly written, and it draws you in. As well, because you're fascinated. Who could this guy be? He's not a monster in the obvious sense, and that's what's.
It is fascinating in that some authors don't specifically describe people. And then that enables readers to then see them in their own way and identify even more. Jane Austen's famous for this and describing her heroines and heroes in her novel, is that she doesn't really specifically describe how they look. She doesn't tell you really how Elizabeth Bennet looks, except she has a pair of extraordinary eyes. But everybody has a picture of her, and that's the way of drawing the reader in. Here, though, it's even Stevenson doubles down on it, because the characters themselves say, I can't even describe him. So you can almost imagine the worst, but imagine the worst in a very kind of shadowy way.
I mean, it's reminded me. I mean, we've just recently we're fortunate enough to live near Shandy Hall, where Lawrence Sterne wrote Tristram Shandy.
I gotta talk about that.
The curator there is a real enthusiast, and he goes through the novel brilliantly with you when you go. And there's one bit with the blank page. I think it's the Widow Rodman, and you get the blank page because she's so beautiful that I can't describe her. You have to draw a picture of her yourself. And Stevenson's playing the same sort of game here in a different way, but he's allowing you to let your imagination run riot. And what does this guy actually look like? I'll try and that is going on as well here.
Well, at the end of this chapter, he says, you're sure he used a key? He asks this because the key means Hyde has authorized use of this door. Like, Hyde has the key. He's allowed to use it. Jekyll has given him the key, but Hyde is the key for Utterson right now. Like, he needs to figure out how he fits into this pattern, because he's in Jekyll's will. Jekyll is giving him everything, even if he disappears, which is really odd. Well, Utterson owns up to Enfield that, like, I have to tell you that I actually know the other party, meaning Jekyll, but he doesn't even say his name of the, like, I just have to tell you, I know who this the other party is. We're not going to say his name out loud. These men are really, into, they protect each other, is what they do. And one of the things that we'll really come to see in this novel is, unlike all of the adaptations, there's no women. This is a novel about men and how they relate to each other and their very masculine society together. And I'm not even, I don't even, I wouldn't even put it past that Stevenson is quite aware of that, and quite aware that the fact that there's an absence of women here, and that's what messes these men up. And this is one of the reasons why they're so hypocritical.
I think at this point as well, hopefully this is a kind of relevant place to bring it in, where we're talking about keys. Is, you mentioned earlier with the Henley Stevenson collaboration on the Deacon Brodie play. And again, another Edinburgh connection here is
There
with
you go. We're going long tonight. Tell us about Deacon Brodie. Who's Deacon Brodie?
with Brodie, the famous 18th century cabinet maker of Edinburgh. Cabinet, very respectable cabinet maker by day, leader of a gang of robbers by night. Got himself into, lived the wild life, got himself into all kinds of financial trouble. One way he saw out of it was by turning to crime and burglary. And as a cabinet maker, he got access to some of the best houses in Edinburgh and was able to take impressions of keys.
He would, yeah,
and have an easy way of getting into the house, which could be seen as if he used it in the daytime, he was a very legitimate figure, could be legitimately there. I think again, Stevenson's playing on this, obviously, with having done the play, he knew the Deacon Brodie story inside out, and in his own bedroom as a child.
Deacon Brodie's 18th century and a famous, criminal, and for being like, a respected member of society and a criminal at night, and is caught and executed, and everybody knows, and especially in Edinburgh, who Deacon Brodie was. In Robert Louis Stevenson's bedroom, there is a cabinet.
There was a wardrobe made by
Deacon Brodie, and he grows up, and Cummy used to tell him stories about it, and so he knew this growing up. Well, then later in life, Stevenson decides he and Henley, his friend Henley, are going to write a play on Deacon Brodie, and they do, and it's a melodrama, and it plays a little bit. It doesn't do very well at all, and Stevenson doesn't even think it's very good. Actually, nobody thinks it's very good except Henley. Henley loves it and wants to keep going at it. So Deacon Brodie and that duality of Deacon Brodie, the good and the bad in him, are really tied up into Stevenson as well. But it's also the keys. That's how we started on this.
Yeah, the fact that the Brodie gets access to these keys and gets access to the houses through it, and it's with the wardrobe itself is you can, if you go to the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh, it's there. And I've stood in front of it. Stevenson's wardrobe made by Deacon Brodie.
Yeah,
just trying
that's amazing.
Soak up the atmosphere from it. So Brodie is there in Stevenson's life from very early on, and he's fascinated again by the duality. But with this, as I said, it is keys. It is. Does he have the right? So maybe they're looking at Hyde. Where's he got that key from? Has he obtained that legitimately? So again, this fog is being cast.
Did you ever see that? Is it a BBC TV movie on Deacon Brodie with Billy Connolly?
No, I haven't seen. I was reading about it.
Yeah, it's very. I think I have a copy of it. I shared it with you. It's very Brodie's he's the sympathetic character. He's poor Deacon Brodie, and it's Billy Connolly playing who everybody likes. So, it's interesting. Search for Mr. Hyde. Now, Utterson has to find out more about this Hyde, and here he explains everything. Now he sits down to his dinner. He sat down to his dinner without relish, with a volume of some dry divinity. I mean, he's really making sure I keep my life as boring as possible. But he can't get Jekyll's will out of his head, and this is where he reveals to us that, as his lawyer, he has drawn up Henry Jekyll's will, and it is, first I have to mention, in case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, etc. I had a question about this from somebody, from Adam, who's listening. I know he's in the chat tonight. When I read Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, etc., I got deja vu to Van Helsing in Dracula. Abraham Van Helsing, MD, DPH, DLit, etc., is literally, it's etc., as part of the other letters added. And he says he can't remember what we said about it during Sundays with Dracula, but we did address it in Sundays with Dracula. And the fact that this Adam says, I definitely, in the case, in Van Helsing's case, I definitely got at least a little whiff of mockery from the long list of degrees. And I guess that in Jekyll's case, since it is included in a legal document, perhaps the long list of degrees makes more sense here, but it still strikes me as a bit silly. Is that just my modern cynical mind at work, or do you think Stevenson had any intent here? What we said at the time in Studies with Dracula, it was Les Klinger was on that episode, and Josh O'Neill, about Van Helsing in that chapter, was that it was over the top listing all these things, but that's the character Stoker was creating. He was creating this like character who knew everything and can do everything, and he was kind of using these initials to kind of clue the people in on that. So it's not quite mocking, but it was Stoker's way of using, it was hyperbole for Stoker, if not quite mocking. But here, I don't think he's mocking. I think it's almost the opposite. I think it's Stevenson's way of establishing Jekyll as the well-established man in society.
It's respectability, isn't it?
Yeah, it means he's respectable.
You've got to treat this man with a degree of awe. If he's got all those letters after his name, he's somebody.
Yeah. So that's where that is. That's a little rabbit hole. It's fun to do. So Studies with Dracula is still available to watch on the Rosenbach's YouTube channel. You can go there. There's a whole playlist. You can watch every episode. The will states that all of Jekyll's possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde. Woo! All you Edwards out there, we all love that when we read that. Edward Hyde was the name chosen. We're going to get to that later in the book. I think in the very last chapter, we'll talk about why Stevenson chose Edward Hyde for this, or the names. But the will says, in case of Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, Hyde gets everything. Except for like a little bit of money that will go to the household, the servants. Number one, that's like Stevenson gets it wrong. There's no will that would allow that. Like illegally, that wouldn't happen. You'd have to, like, there'd be a longer period of time than 3 months. That will would go to probate or something, and like it wouldn't happen. But in the book, of course, Utterson is horrified by this kind of provision, as the dry as dust, by the book, by the rules lawyer that he is. This is, this doesn't make any sense. And he says it offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life. This is upsetting, this is chaos for a will. And now that he has heard the kind of person that Hyde is, now he's like, oh my gosh, now Jekyll must be in trouble with Hyde. That's why he's, I begin to fear it is disgrace. That this is what Enfield thought, right? That Hyde must have been blackmailing Jekyll. That's why Jekyll was willing to pay £100 to get him out of trouble.
I find it interesting in that as well, with the will, the Hyde is described as a benefactor.
Well, that is an interesting word to describe him, huh?
And you would think that would interest
friend and benefactor Edward Hyde. How does Jekyll benefit from his friendship with Edward Hyde? Well, obviously we know, but that's thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't noticed that. That's perfect. And it really go to the whole idea later in this story that we'll see in Jekyll's motives. So this is something you could put a pin in. What are Jekyll's motives for why would you give all your money to him if suddenly you disappeared? That means he has taken over you're going to make it easy on this side of yourself. So, but it's him. So, and that's the point of this. It's he's making it easy on himself because he is him. Anyway, I love all this stuff. And this is why this is an example of, you can't talk about this without knowing that Hyde is Jekyll, Jekyll is Hyde. This stuff is just then a mystery that Utterson is out to solve. Now, it's utterly fascinating in that the first readers didn't know. There was a moment in Andrew Lang. Where is that book? Andrew Lang reviewed this, and he said, we would welcome first we would welcome a specter, a ghoul, or even a vampire gladly rather than meet Mr. Edward Hyde, which is a great description. But he says, without telling the whole story or to some extent spoiling the effect, we cannot explain the exact nature of the relations between Jekyll and Hyde, nor reveal the mode itself, we think, original, though it depends on resources of pseudoscience in which they were developed. That Lang is acknowledging that people who first read this don't know that Hyde is Jekyll. And why would you? It doesn't make any sense as you're approaching it without ever having the novel Jekyll and Hyde being written. And now it's almost a commonplace, but that this Jekyll and Hyde thing could exist, that somebody could be two people, even physically different. But we have to know that now in order to talk about the hypocrisy and the way people approach this and the way these characters are approaching it and what's really going on behind what they're saying. But boy, wouldn't you have liked to have been that original reader?
Complete, because you just wouldn't get it. You would. There's no way you would guess it.
Ugh.
Because we've already had a description of Hyde. That you know that this because they've already mentioned that they know Dr. Jekyll, so you know that Hyde isn't Jekyll, or you think you know.
Yeah.
When you're the first reader, so who is he? And you will read it as if this is a separate character. You'd have you would not be able to guess, I'm sure, what was coming, because it's so different, so original, and so improbable.
I'm already talking too much about the end, but anyway, well, it's not even the end. It's like 2/3 through, and then you have an end. But Utterson goes to another common friend between them, Dr. Lanyon, who lives in the Cavendish Square, the citadel of medicine in London. And Lanyon is apparently, well, Utterson thinks he's still close with Jekyll, but Lanyon says it's more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and such unscientific balderdash. He says that Jekyll was proud, and this is 10 years ago. That they've had this kind of split. So he doesn't know anything about Jekyll's life right now. And then Utterson asks if he's ever heard of Hyde, and he hasn't. And so this is the first dead end. But what this is Utterson is investigating. This is the search of Mr. Hyde. Utterson is the detective in a sense, right? Going around, seeing what he can find out. You go to friends and acquaintances first, see what they know, and then move on from there. Well, he goes home and he goes to bed that night, and he says, actually, before then, I just want to mention this. He says, in asking about Hyde, the language he used, he says, did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde? Using French words, I'm thinking, especially in this, late 19th, close to fin de siècle, makes it sound like a euphemism. And in the OED definition of protege, it's just one who receives the protection or patronage of another. And the word protege did later become a euphemism for a gay man's young lover. But that's in the mid-20th century. And I don't know if it had already started that use in this culture, in this British culture at the time. But with a few other hints in this story, it's not out of the question that it's youth here. It's calling him a protege is at least Utterson's kind of suggesting that there's some kind of improper relationship between Jekyll and Hyde.
And that would very much link into the idea with Enfield, Man of the World, where he's got this thing I call that blackmail house and so on. So yeah, that would tie together that they think they know possibly what is going on here.
Now, Oscar Wilde's not prosecuted for a few years, but that lifestyle that Wilde's leading in London that everybody knows about, and especially Stevenson, who is very in tune with bohemians, artists, people who kind of live on the edges and are constantly pushing the boundaries of what is considered proper and moral in society. This isn't something that's far from Stevenson's mind, and nor does he even condemn it, I don't think. As a matter of fact, there's even a kind of reading you can give to this novel that says that if you just give in to your inner desires, you'd probably be okay. It's suppressing them that hurt you. Anyway, that I wanted to bring that up because this is a theme. This is something that we're going to come up with again, and it's going to have a bearing on how not just people at the time would have read this, not just how we read the story now, but people at the time actually read this story. And we have commentary from the time of how people read this story and thought that Stevenson was perhaps hinting at that kind of lifestyle at the time. There's absolutely a queer reading you can give to Jekyll and Hyde is what I'm saying. I'm not trying to beat around the bush. There's a queer reading you can give to Jekyll and Hyde.
The language is there, as you say, and he definitely moved in. He's moved in Edinburgh's underworld.
Yeah,
as a young man. As he's lived with the artistic community in the Great Loire in France. He's lived in Paris. He's fond of Paris. So he's not naive about these things and fascinated probably in a kind of an observational way. And this book is actually shining light in a kind of abstract way into alternative lifestyles and the threat of alternative lifestyles, and the fact that alternative lifestyles can lie beneath the surface of the most apparently respectable of people. So yeah, the reading can easily be made with it being far-fetched.
All right. At least we have to get the three things in this chapter. Number one is that Utterson now has nightmares about what the story that he's been told about Hyde and everything that's going on. And in these nightmares, in these dreams, first he just sees Enfield's tale of Hyde trampling the girl like a juggernaut, go on like a scroll of lighted pictures, as people used to see in these things that like Edward Muybridge toured with these cameras that would do these almost like an animated pictures that you'd see, then things move. But also he would have a dream where his friend lay asleep, and this would be Jekyll, right? Dreaming and smiling at his dreams, and then the door of that room would be opened. The curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour, he must rise and do its bidding. Does that sound like a scene from another novel before?
It sounds very much like a scene from another novel to me.
And that would be...
Do you allow me to quote it, Ed?
Please.
Yes.
I didn't know you were going to do this. Yes, please.
Yeah,
I have it ready too. Go ahead.
Yes, from the other novel, the quote goes, "I started from my sleep with horror. Cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered and every limb became convulsed, when by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs.
And that
Victor
is,
Frankenstein's description of meeting his monster.
thank you. For the first time, you know, Victor creates the creature. He's horrified by how he looks. He goes to bed, and the creature comes in and wakes him from bed and beckons to him. Out, his hand, one hand was stretched out. And Victor, of course, seemingly to detain me. No, it wanted contact with you. It wanted help. But I'm fascinated that Stevenson, you know, door of that room would be open, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour, he must rise and do its bidding. It's clear that he's saying, and it'll happen again. We get the same thing he alludes to again later. That this creature that Utterson subconsciously seems to know that Hyde is a creature that Jekyll has created, and it is now controlling him, just like in Frankenstein. He subconsciously, he doesn't know it consciously yet because he hasn't figured it all out. But and the Frankenstein connections in this story, right? The Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the men who pursue science and ignore all the women in their life, and what they create destroys others and themselves. Both novels are gothic in mood and theme and imagery, but also both novels are not supernatural, right? They're both tales of Gothic science, and in scientific Gothic that happens in the 19th century with Frankenstein and now this novel and others too, like Island of Dr. Moreau. In scientific Gothic, it's not the past that comes to haunt you, but rather the present that threatens the future. And I'm fascinated that Stevenson recognizes, I think, in this connection with
it's got to be deliberate. It's so close, and also the fact that Jekyll and Hyde was written in Bournemouth. Mary Shelley's buried in Bournemouth. So yeah, he knows what he's doing here, and is probably hoping that readers, those in the know, will spot it. And it will jump out at them straight away and be seen as a kind of little wry smile would come out, and it's so close.
It's more than just like, you know, a shout out to her kind of thing. Like there's a connection. These novels are connected. Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde, and I love that he knows it and acknowledges it.
And they both come from nightmares.
Because the dreams, let's mention this now before we go. Stevenson, by his own account, and by the accounts that were later written about the conception of this story, by his Graham Balfour that put together the biography.
The first biography, yes.
Graham Balfour is Stevenson's nephew. I can't remember.
I think is it nephew or second cousin?
But he's related.
He's definitely related through Stevenson's mother.
And because Stevenson dies so young, then later, decades later, a decade or two later, I can't remember exactly, Balfour writes a biography and gets these accounts from Fanny, from Stevenson's wife, and from Stevenson's stepson, Lloyd Osborne. But Stevenson himself, in 1887, just as he's come across to America after the book's been published, he wrote that the fact is that I am so much in the habit of making stories that I go on making them while I sleep quite as hard, apparently, as when I am awake. They sometimes come to me in the form of nightmares, insofar that they make me cry out loud. But I am never deceived by them. Even when fast asleep, I know that it is I who am inventing, and when I cry out, it is with gratification to know that the story is so good. So soon as I awake, and it always awakens me when I get on a good thing, I set to work and put it together. Now, there's a difference later the way he writes about this, but that's what he says at first. And he also says, all I dreamed about Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll, was that one man was being pressed into a cabinet when he swallowed a drug and changed into another being. I awoke and said at once that I had found the missing link for which I had been looking so long. And before I again went to sleep, almost every detail of the story as it stands was clear to me. Of course, writing it was another thing. Now, so he had a dream about a scene. And he had more than one scene, because he also dreamt the scene. He has the scene where he's taking the potion, and what's the other?
There's the window.
And the window. The girl looking out the window and seeing the murder of Carew. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now later, when he writes about this is actually just later. This is what he says to a reporter, what I had just read. He says this to a reporter, and it's published in The Critic in September 1887. But then he writes a essay on this called A Chapter on Dreams. And I'll actually share this. I'll share a link to it. I'll post it on our webpage, and I'll share it with you all. In 1887, in which he really goes into more detail about how he dreams and how he's inspired by his dreams and the little people that are in his head. All right. These brownies kind of give him stories that he then goes off and writes. This is very important throughout this is his conception of himself as an artist, that he's kind of taken this idea of what we would call the subconscious now, and he calls them brownies that tell him that create stories and tell him what to write, and that he has to write them. Dreams are very important to Stevenson, is the point I'm trying to get to. And in the story, Utterson's having a dream here, right?
Yeah. And it's again very telling that it's Utterson who has the dream. This dry stick of a man is the one who's having these vivid dreams that are then going to lead him on this search. So it's again showing how disturbing the whole story is, the whole story of Hyde, if it can disturb somebody like him who lives in such an ordered life.
Yeah.
And he can't, his sleep is interrupted.
Yeah.
By terrors of Hyde. Show that this is a serious thing going on. This is a serious issue, and it's not something that Utterson can sweep aside at all.
All right, we've kept you up very late. I promise we're going to get through this chapter. Utterson now has to find out who Hyde is. And, he began to, then for that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by street of shops. Like, he's now trying to figure out. And then he has this great quote here: "If he be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek." Great pun, but really it's yes, that's what's going on here. And he finally is rewarded. And here comes Hyde walking down the street one night. He was small, very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. And then he drew a key from his pocket, more keys. He's small, and this is one thing that you should really pick up in this book. Hyde is a little person. He's really small, and Jekyll is taller than him, because Hyde is underdeveloped and younger as well. We get so many Hydes in adaptations where the Hyde is this giant, monster, but in here it's just the opposite, because Hyde is undeveloped morally, that he is also smaller. He hisses like an animal. He says he shrank back with a hissing intake of breath as Utterson accosted Mr. Hyde, I think. And then he gets out his key, blowing in the key, because it's a Brahma key. It's one of those keys that have like a tube, one of those Brahma keys. Joseph Brahma invented them in the 19th century. How did you know me? Hyde says. And Utterson doesn't respond. On your side, will you do me a favor? Like if like saying like, well, if I answer your question, will you answer? Like he doesn't even tell him first. Like he's trying to avoid this. And Hyde again, he's kind of cool and defiant, but and then as Enfield described him. And then Hyde's like, "Oh, it's good that we've met. I should give you my address." And he gives him his card, I guess, with his, address in Soho. Um, and Utterson's shocked at this. He thinks that, oh my gosh, is he thinking of the will? That like if Jekyll dies, it's good that, his lawyer has, Hyde's address. Um, but he's also, Utterson is trying to evade telling how he knows Hyde. And then Hyde says, "You're lying." Oh, he says, how did you know me? And he finally tells her, like, Jekyll told me. And Hyde's like, "You're lying. I did not think you would have lied." And Hyde knows. Now, if you've read the whole book, Hyde knows because Hyde is Jekyll. He can't, you can't lie to him. He knows exactly that. He knows that Jekyll's never told him. He has he snarls. He has a savage laugh. I'm building to something here about the comment Utterson makes about him. But then he unlocks the door and enters the house. That Hyde has access, right? He can go into the door. Hyde is the one who can unlock the door into Jekyll's building, into Jekyll, right? Like he has access. Utterson does not.
And he also he disappears almost by magic, doesn't he?
Yeah, he disappeared. He says he disappeared.
Yeah, and he's gone.
And now Utterson describes him. He was pale and dwarfish, gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation, just like Enfield had described him. There was a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, a husky and whispering and somewhat broken voice. These were points against him. Oh, thanks. Like, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. He says the man seems hardly human, something troglodytic, shall we say. That he is like a savage creature from the past, right? Actually, he says three things. He says he seems troglodytic, or is it the old story of Dr. Fell? Old 17th century ditty, "I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. The reason why I cannot tell. But this I know, and I know full well, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell." I mean, just I don't like you because I don't like you kind of idea. Or is it because is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? Stevenson was the word there, right? Clay continent to describe, our human, our physical, our corporeal bodies. Utterson says it's probably three. It's soul. He has a foul soul. That's why he is an evil person, and evil, who's evil, right? Just look at them and you can feel the evil coming off them. This is a very Victorian idea, that you could sense someone's, moral presence, whether they're good or they're evil. But this is also the first time soul is used in this book. And I point this out too, because soul is used 15 more times. And the majority of times that we see the word soul will be in Jekyll's confession in the last chapter. So soul becomes a big deal. I think it's like 7 times, and there's 6 times, and it's like 9 times in that Jekyll will use the word soul. Later on, that'll be how we kind of interpret what's going on in this book. For Stevenson, I think it's about someone's soul. All right. Finally, Utterson's like, I just have to ask Jekyll. And so he goes and he goes to his house to meet Jekyll. And then I realized actually, we don't even meet Jekyll in this book. It's called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but we meet Hyde in a story and get and we get about him, and then we meet him actually, and it's Hyde the one who we meet first in this book. Jekyll doesn't come until chapter 3. He goes to see if Jekyll's home, and he asks his servant Poole, Poole. And Poole says no, he's not home, and he asks about Hyde. He says, I saw Hyde going in, and he says, Mr. Hyde has a key. Yes, he does. Thank you for saying that, Poole. Mr. Hyde has a key. He's the key for Utterson here. And they all have orders to obey him, and and now this is the end here, the end of this chapter. Utterson's thinking, poor Harry Jekyll. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. It must be that the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming, pede claudo, meaning with halting step, years after memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault. He's very concerned that it's some Jekyll's past sins are coming back to get him, which is a very Gothic idea for this book. One of the things I think that Stevenson is doing with this book as a new scientific Gothic is what the irony is it's not the past coming back to haunt you. It's with what you're doing now that is, affecting you for the future. And it also leads Utterson to start thinking about his own past, even though he's not done anything wrong, right? He still thinks, I'm humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. Hyde will have secrets of his own, and if only Jekyll would let him find out what those are, then he could get Hyde out of his will and he could feel better. But the chapter ends on, again, it's, the sins of Jekyll's past, and everybody thinking that there must be something really wrong here that has affected him. We haven't even met Jekyll. Descriptions of him: good man, pillar of society, wrong-headed views of science, wild youth, and that's all we get. Next week, we'll meet Jekyll. And then so again, but go ahead.
I just when we have the scene with Utterson going round to the front door.
Oh yeah,
I always love the description of the front side of it, which is a square of ancient handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of men. And then I love the all sorts he describes as map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. Yeah, it's just a brilliant list.
Yeah.
So even the respectable side is beginning to go down. And I also think there's another literary reference going on here, again, Stevenson thrown with the all sorts and conditions of men, to Walter Besant's 1882 novel of that title. And again, part of that London literary scene. And Walter Besant would go on to found the Society of Authors. I just think it's Stevenson again throwing in another little, like with the Frankenstein, throwing in another little literary reference. And I also wonder on that ground, with Poole, is Poole named after Grace Poole in Jane Eyre, the keeper of secrets?
That's
the servant who knows things that are going on. So again, I don't know. I might be being fanciful there, but because we know he does throw in literary references. Mm.
Well, I think no, but we do find out by the end of this, if he is making that reference, this is a fool who doesn't know.
No, he knows half the story.
Yeah.
He doesn't know the rest yet.
Yeah. So,
Mm.
and Grace Poole knew everything.
She's there from the start.
Yeah.
It's
But and thank you for pointing that out too, because also for people that the one street has the front door to Jekyll's house, and then you go through, and then there's a back door, and there's a courtyard, and then that courtyard connects to another building, which then leads off into the street behind, and that's the building that Hyde has access to, and then that building is a medical building. We'll learn more about this in future chapters. And then so Jekyll's house, Jekyll's property has two doors. The front door, respectable, where respectable people would go to, and the back door with no knocker that only Hyde has a key to. So, all righty. Well, thank you for bringing that up. Well, next week, then we meet Jekyll, and then the murders begin. Thank you for hanging with us tonight. All you are still out there. Biblioventures, thank you for joining us for episode 1 of Monsters and Ghosts. Paul, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Ed. It's been fun.
Hanging in so late for you. Thank you. You will return in a couple weeks. Our co-host schedule is available on our webpage. Paul will alternate with Olivia Rottigliano, and then Leslie Klinger will join us for the final episode. On the next show, episode 2, Olivia will join me to talk about chapters 3, 4, and 5 when we meet Jekyll and there is a murder. I want to thank our chat pool, Brianna, Jekyll's butler. That's what we're gonna and for Sherlock, our chat assistant was our chat Mrs. Hudson. So I figured for this you have to be the chat pool, and that's Brianna. Thank you, Brianna, for managing the live chat links. We couldn't do these shows also without the generous support of our patrons. You can support the Rosenbach through donation. Your support helps us create more programs like this and also care for our collections. You could also become a member. Membership gives you early access and discounts to programs and courses. You can find out more at our website, rosenbach.org. Remember, if you are watching live and become a member on this date of the live show, you will receive an additional month added to your membership. So you'll get 13 months of membership and just pay for 12, like regular people do. Again, let me remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to like these videos if you're, and that's it. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library, where the door to your Biblio venture is always open, Paul. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Good night.